Welcome to another video in the TimCo Retail Manager course. This course focuses on real-world application development. Right now, we're working on building out our first section of work, which is a basic register. In this video, we're going to wire up our login form to actually authenticate against the database. Now, if you're Patreon supporter at the $5 per month level or higher, make sure you head over to get the latest source code. Either way, make sure you're subscribed to this channel so you can follow along. And finally, as you think of suggestions, please leave them down in the comments. I want to hear your thoughts on this course. I've got a running list of suggestions for improvements, and they'll definitely be making this application better. Now, one of the suggestions that came up from the last video was on the code we got from Stack Overflow. And that caused some people to be concerned. And the concern was this copy-paste programming. We're taking somebody's code and just plunking it in, and that can be dangerous, and it absolutely can. But there is a balance. So let's look at the code real quick. First of all, whenever you paste code in, you should review it. Okay? So try and understand what it's doing and why it's doing it. Otherwise, what can happen is you can paste code in that either does something that you're not expecting, or that does something malicious, and you invited it into your code base. That's dangerous. On the other hand, if you are careful, if you review your code, even if you don't understand everything, I know it's going to make some people a little nervous, but even if you don't understand everything, if you look through it and try to understand it, then you're probably okay. Doubly so, and this is also very, very important, depending on where you got it from. So we got it from Stack Overflow, which already brings it a step above just the basic place to get code. Okay? Because Stack Overflow is peer reviewed. And so when we got this code, it wasn't from a suggestion that had 0 votes or -5 votes. It had positive votes. Now, I don't remember what the number was, but there was a number of people that said, yes, this works. The comments down below said, yes, I've tried this and it works. And so what we get is this peer review where it's not just us reviewing the code, it's somebody else as well, which also means it's important for us to upvote the code and also to say, yes, it worked for me too, or this is a good solution, or I found this thing should be tweaked a little bit. Okay? So that's just a thought process, but as long as you do that process to some extent, you should be okay. You are still responsible, though, for this code. And this is a little bit of a tangent, but that's why I'm not a huge fan of entity framework. Okay? And I know you've probably heard before from me that I'm not a huge fan of EF. But the reason why is because it creates code that now I have to support. Because if you have code in your application and it breaks, it's on you to support it. It's only if the code is in somebody else's library or it's in a DLL from Microsoft, only then do you not have to support it directly. You may have to live with the consequences of it, but you don't have to support it directly. But any code that gets created or gets put into your project as code is now yours to support. So that's just something to be thinking about when you're using any kind of code generation. It's great that it generated the code. Can I support it? That doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It just means you need to think about it. Just like here, we need to think about, should we copy and paste? Okay? Now, one final thought. We do use an awful lot of code that isn't our own. I love Dapper. Dapper, I think, is a great tool for getting information in and out of a database quickly and easily. That's a whole bunch of code that I have not reviewed, that I bring into my application every time. And the reason why I am comfortable doing that is a couple reasons. First of all, I know the creators. Second of all, it is open source software that has been peer reviewed a lot. So those two things really help me make a decision about what to bring in. So the danger is if you say, well, all open source is good, and so you go and grab any open source project and bring it in. The danger there is, what if there's not much of a following? Maybe it's not been peer reviewed, and maybe you don't know the people that have created it. That code is on you to support, especially since it's open source. Even if it's in a DLL form, that may not be something they support as well as an actual company would. So that kind of addresses the copy and pasting thing and my thoughts on it. I'm comfortable with where we're at right here. Now, the other question that was raised, and this is why you should leave comments down in the description, because I really do read them, process them, and I even change what I do based upon the comments. So the other thought was raised was, there's a reason why the password box doesn't bind well with MVVM. And that's because they're trying to make sure that that password is never stored in clear text. And that is an admirable goal that we're bypassing. Okay? So yes, we are reducing the security of our application in order to make it work with MVVM. That's a choice. However, also know that you can't just look at that in a vacuum and say that is bad. In this case, I think it's a good decision. And here's why. The way it reduces the security of our application is it stores that password in our RAM in clear text. So if a hacker had access to our machine and they have access to read directly our random access memory on our computer, then there's a potential they could read our password. But here's the deal. If someone is so deep into your system that they have access to your random access memory, they also have access to your keyboard inputs. So when you type ABC123 for your password, which please don't, but if you do, they can capture the keystrokes just as easily, actually more easily, than reading your RAM. So while yes, this does somewhat reduce the security of the password box, it does not reduce it significantly. Okay? So that's something to know. The other thing is, either way, we have to pull this password out in order to pass it into a HTTP client call to the API, which will be over HTTPS. So either way, that password has to be at some point in clear text, because we can't keep it in a secure password box all the way through to the call. Okay? So yes, in some ways we're reducing security, but in other ways we're not. And either way, the reduction in security is not a significant one, and it's not a danger. It's like saying, if we build our castle walls 50 feet high, it's dangerous to lower them to 45. Well, that could be true if that 45-foot wall is the lowest or least secure area. But if you leave the front gate open, it doesn't matter if your password, your walls are 45 feet high or 50 feet high. Just doesn't matter. Okay? The front door is open. So you want to bring all your security levels all up at the same level. So having one ridiculously high, not ridiculously high, very high. Having one security level very high doesn't really benefit you unless everything is at that same height. Okay? So that's why I'm comfortable with the password box working with MVVM. I am thankful, though, that Microsoft didn't just say, yeah, you can add on that security later. I like the fact that it's secure by default. So I do appreciate that. I do wish it was a little easier to tone down that security, but that's for a future version of WPF. Okay? So that's where we kind of left off, and that kind of addresses the copy paste and the password box issue. Now let's start moving forward and address what this video is really about, which is about how to get our login form, which is this one right here. How to get this login form to to work with our API. Let's zoom in just a little bit. There we go. So how to get this to work with our API so that when we hit login, it actually goes to the API, gives the username and password, and gets back that token if they successfully log in. So you got a few things to do to get to that point. I think the first thing we need to do is we need to create a way to talk to the API. So I'm going to start by putting this in helpers. But I'm thinking that eventually, not this video, but probably in the future, we're going to need to look at creating at least a user interface class library. Now I say a user interface class library because I'm not sure that we want to share a full class library with the API. I'm thinking maybe we have one that the API uses, one that the user interface uses, and maybe a shared one beyond that. For example, I don't want any code for data access to be in the user interface library. So I don't want the user interface to have any access to SQL or MySQL or any of that stuff. It doesn't know about that stuff at this point. And if it did, it would probably be something more along the lines of MongoDB, a client-side, more easily client-side database where it's for caching or for short-term information or just storage of information that's not secure and does not need to be kept for a long time. Okay, so let's just for now use the helpers folder and create a new class. And we're going to call this class API helper and make it public. And what this is going to do is it's going to handle all of our API call interactions so that the views just call this and say, give me this, give me this, give me this, and they get it back. And again, we're going to create it this way for now. We may refactor it in the future to break it into more pieces. But I have found it's much easier to create the code now, the way it works now, and then refactor rather than trying to come up with the perfect design. Because what happens is you over design it, so it doesn't follow the you're not going to need it principle, and you make it so complex and you spend a whole lot of time on it when the reality is you need a few method calls and you didn't know what you'd need later. So let's build what we need today and also look to the future a little bit. So let's have a public property called HTTP client or of type HTTP client. And I can't tab because I did my control dot. We'll call this the API client. And then we're going to have a public void. Let's actually make it private void. Private void initialize client. And if you watch the video that I did on consuming APIs, this is pretty much a copy paste from that. API client equals new HTTP client. API client dot default request headers dot accept dot clear. So clear out those headers so you start from a blank slate. And then we're going to add our own in, which is a new media type with quality header value. And let's go ahead and shorten that down, which will need to do a control dot and add a using statement for it. And then inside of our paren, we can say application/JSON. And that says that we're looking for JSON data back. We're not looking for XML, we're looking for JSON. Now I made this client, initialize client private, because I'm actually going to come up here and do a CTOR for constructor. Visual Studio is through an error, and we're going to ignore it. Maybe call it an extension. Woohoo, that's awesome. You get that once in a while if something's just not quite, working together right. A restart of Visual Studio can help sometimes, but in this case, I don't think it'll be a problem that we have to deal with, so I'll leave it alone. So inside my constructor, I call initialize client, so that whenever you create a new API helper, it's going to immediately initialize that client so that it's ready to go. So this public property will always be ready to go as soon as you create the instance. How is this helpful? Well, we're going to have one HTTP client for the lifespan of our application. That way we don't have multiple HTTP clients open and clog up our network. So now what we need to do is we need to create a call that will call out to the API using this client. It'll call out to the API and send our login and password and get back our token information. So for right now, we'll return void, but let's make a public void, and then let's call this authenticate. Or, yeah, that works. String username, string password. There we go. So now in here, what we can do is we can actually make the call. So let's set up let's just do var data equals new form URL encoded content. And then inside here, a new array, and then curly braces to fill in the array. So what am I doing here? Well, we have to send form URL encoded content for the username and the password and the grant type. So let's say new key value pair of type string. And the first one's going to be grant type. And that is password. And then, whoops, not a semicolon, a comma. And in fact, let's copy this whole line. And I'm going to paste it 2 more times. Instead of grant type, it'll be username. And instead of grant type down here, it will be password. And then the username is our username variable. And the password is our password. So this creates the data that we'll send to that API endpoint. Now we can create our using statement. And inside here, we can say HTTP response message. We'll call it response equals await. That means we need to mark this as async. We'll do that in a minute. And we really shouldn't return void. We should return task at the very least. But await. And then let's say our client, which is API client dot post async. We need to give it the URL for the API endpoint. And then we need to format the content. Oops, not format. We need to send the data. We've already formatted it. All right, there we go. So we're sending the data for our call. Now it's yelling at us right now because we have the await with no async. So let's do the async and return task for right now. And that's essentially returning void for an async method. It's not void because we actually return a task saying, okay, it's not done yet, but I'll tell you when it is done. And that's what we await on the other end. So we haven't filled in the URL yet. And the reason why is because we could fill in the whole URL. The problem there is that URL is going to change. Right now it's going to be a local host address. Eventually it will be an address in Azure or on our local machine or our local web server or something else. And so that isn't something we should hard code here. Instead, what we want to do is pass just the relative path to /token. And the way to do this is to set up here, we should set up a base address. So API client dot base address equals new URI, and then paste in our URI string, which is the location of our API. But that doesn't really help us much because if we hard code it here, it's the same thing as hard coding it down here. The only difference is we hard code it once. So what we'll need to do is we need to pop open our app.config, and we need to add a section here for app settings. Inside here, we need to add an app setting. The key is going to be the, let's call it just the API. And the value equals, and here's where we can actually give it a real value. How do we know what value to put in? Well, we can go over here and look on the TRM Data Manager. We go to Properties, and under, I believe it's Web. There we go. There's the HTTP version. We don't have an HTTPS because we're in dev. This is something that's going to actually change when we move over to .NET Core, which is lovely. And that is by default, you get HTTPS out of the box, and you set up a developer certificate very easily. And now you can test in a truly secure environment. But for now, we can just copy this URL and then come over here and paste it in. Now we just need to get that into this location right here. So let's add a reference. Let's minimize the data manager, the API. Let's add a reference in here to the, it's system.configuration. Check the box here. Hit OK. And now in here we can do is we can actually grab that configuration. Let's do it up here. So let's say string API equals, and then say configuration manager, control dot, add the using statement for using system.configuration. So configuration manager dot, and then we say app settings, and we give it our key. And our key is API. And that should load the API's URL into here. How does this help us? Well, this app.config can be changed at any time, not just before we compile. We can change it after it's in runtime, in production. And also, we can create a config file override where when we build this, let's look at it here, we can actually bring in all right, there we go. We can actually bring in another type of file and basically merge it in, override this with whatever value we have in dev, in staging, in production, and other areas. So we probably create a app.release.config or something of that nature that would have an override for this with a variable that our build system could pick up and replace in the different spots. Or we can just put it right in our build system, say, look for this app setting, replace it with whatever value you need. Okay, so this is just for local that we have this URL. For anything beyond that into our central development server, our central testing server, our central QA server, our central production server. All of those will get different values here without having to recompile the application. All right, so now this right here, this authenticate, should allow us to, with a username and password, call the token and get back a response. Once we have a response, we can say if response.is success code or success status code, then we're going to put our value, let's just say var for now, result equals and await response dot content dot read as async. And we don't have the read as async with the model type. We'll get that in a minute. Read as async. Let's for right now autocomplete got me there. And let's just say string for right now. Okay, I think we actually have a problem here based upon what we're using for our system.net.http. Let's add a reference here. Let's go to Manage NuGet Packages and actually look for the ASP.NET Web API.client. This one right here from Microsoft. Let's install this and hit OK. And I accept. And then I'll make sure we have Newtonsoft and the rest. Let's go ahead and update Newtonsoft to a much later version while we're here. And again, since we're adding this right now, it's not a problem. If we already had it installed, you want to be a little more careful about just updating something without testing it thoroughly. Okay. So now notice down here, read as string async now works because it has that extension method which comes from the Web API library. Now that we have this in place, we've got to figure out what data goes in here. So let's go and actually set the API as startup project. And this is just an easy way to test a couple different things. One, that we know what our password is still, because it's been a little bit. And also that our API is running properly still, even though it should be. And finally, that we can see what information comes back by actually making a call. So it's tim@timcorey.com and a password, I believe it's pwd12345, period. If you didn't know, what you could do is actually go to accounts and create a new one. Let's try this out and see what happens. Now, the first time, since I just launched it, it's a little slow. But we get back this information. Access token, token type, expires in username, and .issued and .expires. The only things I really care about right now are access token and username. So let's create a model that has those two things in it in order to pass into this mapping method here. So access underscore token and username. Let's create a new model in models. And we're going to call this the authenticated user. I get public, prop, string, access, token, and prop, string, username. Okay, those are two values. We're going to copy that model name, come over here and paste it here instead. So now I'm going to control dot to actually add the using statement that brings in that model's namespace. So now I can modify to get this right here. Actually, I'll copy the angle brackets too. and paste it right next to task. So it actually returns back a task of type authenticated user by just saying return result. Now this is in the if statement, so we need an else statement. Oops. There we go. And this is where we're going to throw an exception. Throw new exception and say the response dot reason phrase. Basically, why did you fail? Okay, so if we succeed, then we grab the information from the content and put it into an authenticated user model and return that model. If, however, we fail, then return the reason why we failed inside of an exception. Now, what are the odds that this works on the first time? Not real high, but that's okay. We've written some code and we kind of self-contained it into this one little thing, which is good because I want to test it as soon as possible. So let's start using this API helper right away. But before I can do that, I have to actually somehow use it in my dependency injection system. So let's actually do this. Let's do control dot on our API helper class and extract an interface, API helper, and let's grab all this information. The one thing I'm not convinced about, let's uncheck API client. And hit OK. And the reason I'm not terribly convinced by API client is because I don't think we need to have direct access to it from outside of this API helper. Because we don't care about the implementation, we just need the end results. And API client, the HTTP client, kind of is too much of the caring about the implementation. So let's actually change this to a lowercase a now, do a control dot and rename it. And now it's private and it only works inside here, but it has, as long as you've instantiated this class, which you have to, then it will get created, it'll get instantiated itself, and it will live the lifespan of this class instance. So now we have this in place. Let's go over to Bootstrapper, and down here, I'm going to add a singleton. Now, a singleton will only create one instance of a class. So every time you ask for the window manager, you get the same window manager instance. It's a singleton. It's not something you should use a lot. It's something to be careful of. It's roughly equivalent to having a static class that holds data. Roughly equivalent is not the same, but it's close. Okay, so it's only used in certain circumstances, this being one of them though. We want that HTTP client, we want one of them, and we want to have it open the entire lifespan of our application, which is perfect for a singleton. API helper, which is an API helper, and there we go. So now we can just ask for an API helper wherever we are, and we'll get the same instance, which, since it gets built right away, it will have that HTTP client active and ready for us to use. So let's copy that constructor, the interface, and let's come over here and close a few more things. And in our code behind for login form, which is actually our login view model, when they hit login, this is where we're actually going to call that method on the API helper. So let's create a constructor for this, since we don't have one. Oops, there we go. C2R, and I'm going to have a private API helper So control dot to add the using statement. And we're going to call this underscore API helper. Like so. And I am going to ask for it in my constructor. I'll just call it API helper, not underscore. And now I can say underscore API helper equals API helper. So that's going to use dependency injection to say I need an iAPI helper. It's going to fill it. We're going to assign it to this private variable that we can now use down here. So underscore API helper dot authenticate. And we need to have a username and password, which that should be username and password. And password. However, this is an async method, so we should make this, I'm not sure if we can make it task or not, but we're going to try. And we're going to make it async. And we'll say await. And the result should be a authenticated user model. So let's just say var result equals, and then what we'll do is I'm going to put a breakpoint right here and inspect this. I'm also going to put a breakpoint right before it just to make sure it's actually going to get hit since we changed this from void to a task and made it async. So now we should be all set to use our login form and just see what happens. And it's going to start my API project. We got one more thing we got to cover first. That is, if I start my API project, my UI doesn't start. If I start my UI, my API project doesn't start. Unless we want to start multiple applications. So on solution, go to properties, multiple startup projects under startup project on the left here. And we want to say that the data manager and the desktop UI want to start. We want debugging on both sides. So start, not start without debugging. Hit apply. Now notice that none of these over on the right-hand side are bold. So it's not a great system for showing you which ones are starting, but it does work. So let's hit start. And once that builds, I have my API started. Let's bring that over here. And I also have my login form. Okay, so now let's put my Tim at IamTimCorey.com and PWD 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, period. We need to make those boxes bigger. Hit login. It does pause right here, which is great. The username and password are correct. So now we can take this breakpoint off. We know it works. And hit continue. And now we see that it's gone to our next breakpoint, which is at the end here. So let's mouse over result. And result, we can actually come down here and open it up. We have an access token and we have a username. So it actually worked the first time out of the gate, which is pretty awesome. Now, what we didn't test for is a bad username or password. We should test for that too. So let's hit continue. And it just pops back up because we didn't do anything now that we're logged in. So we'll have to do that. But for right now, let's just TI instead of Tim. Hit login. And wait. And wait. And nothing seems to be happening. So let's make sure it's hitting our breakpoint. We hit login. It goes there. I can't really step into it necessarily. Oh, there we go. It's actually stepping in, which is awesome. It stepped in across projects. I was wondering if the async would cause a problem, but it didn't. Okay, let's look at the status code, it's false. The response status code, let's go to the reason phrase. So response, reason phrase is bad request. So it's going to throw a new exception, which it did, and nothing happened. We just ate it. Not a great system right now. So let's change that. Let's wrap our call in a try catch. So right click, then we say snippet, surround with try. And then we'll say exception EX. And here for right now, what we'll do, we won't throw anything. We're just going to do a console write line, which we don't have a console necessarily. That's okay. That's just for us to put a breakpoint here. Let's start again and test to see if we're actually going to hit this breakpoint. So TEST, log in, and there we go. EX.message. EX is bad request. EX.message is bad request. So now we know that we have a valid system for both if it's a successful login and if it's a failed login. Now, successful is a relative term. We're catching both, we're handling both situations. We're not handling it well yet, but that's the next step. We now know we can handle it. Now we need to know what we should do since this is invalid. I'm sorry, since this one is invalid. I think what we'll do is leave off right here. And the reason why is because we've got one piece working, and that is the login form. When we fill in the username and password correctly, it actually gets back the authentication information. And if we put it in incorrectly, it throws an exception that we can then catch. I think what we'll do next, and this will be the next video, is we're going to tackle what do you do now? I think what we'll do is we'll put some sort of validation message here between the login form and this first username label and box that's hidden normally, but it's in red and it says something like invalid login name and or password, and have that display if you fail to log in properly. If you succeed though, I think what we'll do is we will build a new model that will be another one of the singletons down here. So add a new model that's something like logged in user, and that will contain the GUID the bearer token of the user and also their email address. That way we can have a bearer token to send new calls through. And we can also have the email address to know who they are. But I think we'll also ask for their username or their first name and their last name as well. And that will be a separate API call, which we don't have in place yet, but that we can make right in this login view model call. So we can make it right here. Once we get the result, then the next thing we'll do is we'll await the extra information about the user. That way we can have a complete picture of who they are. So we can display on a page, welcome Tim, and we can have user details about first name, last name, email address. And so you have all that information, and then we can also use that bearer token for all our future calls. So that's what I think we'll do next time. But for this time, we've got the authentication system in place. We have talked to our API. We've got actually the API and the WPF application launching at the same time now. We can talk to the API. We can log in and either see that we failed to log in, or we can get back the information with the bearer token and the email address of the user. So I think that's good. So now let's go to Team Explorer. This is one of those things I forget to do a lot of times when I'm on camera, but we'll go to Changes. And we're going to review the changes that we've done. Now, in this case, they all look right. I say, yes, I know why I did all of these changes. So I can select them all in Stage. And we'll just give it a commit message. Wire up login form to API. Connects the login form button to the authentication API endpoint, which is /token. Gets back the bearer token or an exception if failed. So this kind of gives us an idea of what this code is doing. And now we can commit staged. Click sync. We're going to do a fetch first to make sure we haven't missed any changes, which of course we haven't because I'm a single developer. But that's okay. It's a good habit to be in. And now we'll push those latest changes up to GitHub. And we're done. So that's it for this video. In the next video, we'll continue working on this login form to give some response back to the user when they fill it out incorrectly, and also to get more information about the user when they do fill it incorrectly. Okay? As always, I am Tim Corey.